The FBI's most wanted list. It's the closest thing American crime has to a Hall of Fame, but there's no reason you can't make a buck off it. Find some of these, and you'll be in for a big reward. In 1987, Glen Stewart Godwin escaped from California's Folsom State Prison, where he was serving time for robbery and murder. Supposedly, his former cellmate, Lorenz Karlik, had set up an escape route for Godwin by cutting bars that closed off a storm drain and marking the route away from the prison with arrows and a smiley face. Karlik was rearrested and then took himself out, if you know what I mean, rather than rat out Godwin. Godwin's wife Shelley was sought for questioning, and she was later arrested on the basis of some conveniently timed absences from work and car rentals in San Jose and Sacramento. Godwin made like many an American fugitive and went to Mexico. It helps that he's fluent in Spanish. There, he was arrested on drug trafficking charges, only to murder a fellow inmate and escape again in 1991. He got away under murkier circumstances that time, and details haven't made it into publicly available reports. Godwin hasn't been reliably spotted since, though suspected sightings are regularly reported. His reward is only $20,000, so maybe not worth the risk to even bother looking.
Haiti has not had a functioning government in years.
And you know who loves non-functioning governments? Gangs. Vitel'Homme Innocent heads one of the many armed factions, the Croix Barrier gang. In 2021, the Croix Barrier allied with another gang, 400 Mawozo, to abduct 16 U.S. missionaries and one Canadian who lived in Port-au-Prince for ransom. Thankfully, all of these captives, including 5 children, were released or escaped over the following months. In October 2022, Jean and Marie Odette Franklin were living in Haiti and soon came face to face with gang violence. During an attempt to seize and hold the Franklins for ransom, Marie was shot and killed. Then, Jean was held for some 3 weeks while his family negotiated with Innocent's group to ransom him. Innocent was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list in November 2023 for charges related to these hostage takings and Marie Franklin's murder. The U.S. Department of State is offering $2 million in reward money for information leading to his arrest or conviction. That's a lot of money, but is it worth being kidnapped? Probably not. Want to collect a quick $5 million from the US government? All you have to do is find a pig. Colombia has a long history of battles with rebel groups. They actually made peace with FARC, probably the only one you've ever heard of, in 2016. But that's only one rebel group. There's still plenty out there. One of these is the Narco-Terrorism Paramilitary Organization, ELN, or National Liberation Army.
The group is a holdout in the country's peace process and is considered a terrorist organization by Colombia and several other governments.
One of its key members is Wilver Villegas-Palomino, aka Carlos El Puerco, or Charles the Pig. According to the FBI, narcotics produced in laboratories under the pig's control in northeastern Colombia are smuggled into the US for sale, and potentially compose nearly 80% of all cocaine imports into the United States. This drug trafficking, along with money laundering, weapons trafficking, kidnapping, and murders, have earned El Puerco a $5 million bounty for his capture. Politically, negotiations between the Colombian government and the ELN collapsed in September 2024. Leaders of the group are thought to be hiding in Cuba or Venezuela, and Charles the Pig could be among them. Pretty risky, but it is $5 million. Bulgarian-born Ruja Ignatova conspired with others to market a fraudulent cryptocurrency called OneCoin. Going by the alias Crypto Queen, she and her associates piggybacked off the Bitcoin craze to run a multi-level marketing enterprise scam. Their investors talked others into buying cryptocurrency and received commissions on funds they were able to bring in. Millions of investors, or at least people who thought they were investors, put over $4 billion worth of money into OneCoin. If that sounds a bit like a pyramid scheme, it's probably because it was a pyramid scheme. As we now know, OneCoin was a sham. It had no blockchain of its own, and its prices did not move according to market forces. Instead, they seemed to reflect what the scamsters wanted it to be worth. Ignatova's partner in crime, the Anglo-Swedish Carl Sebastian Greenwood, was arrested in Thailand in 2018. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison and $300 million in asset forfeiture for the fraud and related charges. Ignatova has not been seen since October 2017. 1 week after charges were filed against her in the US, she flew from Sofia, Bulgaria to Athens. When she arrived in Greece, she disappeared. The feds are dangling a hefty $5 million reward for information leading to her apprehension, but the well-connected Ignatova has yet to be snared. Now, we're certainly not saying you should risk trying to find hardened criminals, but if you're actually going to look, the crypto queen might be the one to target. Bhadreshkumar Chetanbhai Patel is wanted for the murder of his wife Palak during their shift at a Maryland Dunkin' location. This is pretty horrific. just be warned. Mr. Patel and his wife are said to have argued about a possible return to India, which Palak wanted and he did not. CCTV footage indicates that the Patels went into the back of the shop where Mr. Patel stabbed Palak with a kitchen knife multiple times.
Palak was young. The scene was very brutal, and she died in a horrible way.
The attack reportedly occurred during working hours. It wasn't until a would-be customer entered and found no one working that the alarm was raised. Patel has not been seen since shortly after the incident. He returned home for some papers, got a cab to the train station, and was last seen in Newark, New Jersey. Police posit that he was smuggled out of the United States. It's possible he went to Canada or Ecuador where he has family connections. There's a $250,000 reward for his capture. Not everyone is still out and about from this list, so here are a few classics still worth mentioning that made the list but are now positively located, one way or the other. When the main Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints banned polygamy in 1890, a number of groups split off to continue the practice. One of these, the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, or FLDS, grew to encompass a criminal empire of child marriage, sex trafficking, and abuse. This all went down under the leadership of prophet and pervert Warren Jeffs, who ruled his cult with an iron fist. He did unspeakable things to his own daughters and took minors as wives. He even claimed to decide who went to heaven and injected young men to free up more women for him and his buddies.
He kicked you out, but he tore your family from you.
Jeffs was added to the most wanted list in 2006 for facilitating marriages between children and adults, though the list of charges grew as the investigation continued. But as it turns out, declaring yourself a prophet isn't a great way to keep a low profile. He was caught that August in a traffic stop near Las Vegas with a suspicious cargo of wigs, cell phones, and cash. His initial guilty verdict was overturned, but new charges for, you guessed it, marrying more children brought him back to court. He's serving life plus 20 years. This one's a bit of a bonkers case from the most wanted list. In December 1980, jewel thief and mob affiliate Donald Eugene Webb committed the first murder in the history of the small town of Saxonburg, Pennsylvania. When Police Chief Gregory Adams pulled over a car with out-of-state plates in a parking lot, the driver shot him twice. As he died, Adams called in the attack. Conveniently, the killer left a fake driver's license at the scene, which was enough for investigators to track the phony identity back to Webb. The car was found ditched in Rhode Island 17 days later, but Webb was nowhere to be seen. He was placed on the most wanted list in 1981, and in late 1999 became the contemporary record holder for the longest time on the list. In 2017, the truth emerged. Webb had been badly injured in the struggle with Adams and had entered a hospital under an assumed name. Eventually, he returned home to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where his wife Lillian hid him in a secret room for nearly 20 years. In that time, she even successfully moved him to a new house without getting caught.
Kind of reads like a murder mystery. And Donald Webb had a wife who knew how to keep a secret.
In 1999, Webb died of a stroke. With the help of a Tupperware storage container, Mrs. Webb dragged his body outside and buried him. The FBI unearthed his remains in 2016. Later news reports gloated that while Webb escaped the courtroom, the injuries that he had sustained in 1980 led to pain and disfigurement that may have served as some measure of retribution. During the 1990s, the public debate over abortion was punctuated by a series of high-profile attacks against abortion clinics and providers. Among these was the October 1998 murder of Dr. Barnett Slepian, a Buffalo area abortion provider. The doctor was shot through the window of his home right in front of his wife and one of his sons. The killer, James Charles Kopp, fled justice by traveling through Mexico and Ireland. He ultimately hid in France, where he was arrested while waiting for a package at a local post office. Kopp, who was also a suspect in more than a few attacks on abortion providers in Canada, was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the murder. He received another life sentence with an additional 10 years for associated federal charges. Kopp has appealed these sentences several times. When Roe v. Wade was overturned, he argued that this decision proved people never had the right to the procedure in the first place. He also claimed in courtroom documents that he had not been allowed to mount a defense based on the, quote, humanity of womb children. In the history of the most wanted list, only 11 women have ever been so honored. Of these 11, 3 studied at Brandeis University: Black activist Angela Davis and anti-war activist Susan Ida Sachs and Katherine Ann Power. Like many, Sachs and Power were out there protesting the Vietnam War. Unlike others, they went just a bit further. Their group decided to rob a bank and give the money to the Black Panthers, who they believed would use it to overthrow the government. One of the conspirators, William Gilday, fatally shot responding officer Walter Schroeder in the back. The The men were caught quickly, but Sachs and Power were able to evade capture long enough to reach the most wanted list. Sachs was snagged in 1975 and later pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Power remained on the lam for 23 years. She lived in Oregon as a restaurateur under an alias, but ultimately negotiated her surrender to Massachusetts authorities through go-betweens. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges.
My inner state at that time was that I was still a warrior.
Power was sentenced to 8 to 12 years for the robbery and murder, and a concurrent 5-year sentence on federal charges related to the fact that the weapons used in the heist had been stolen from a National Guard armory. A provision of her plea deal forbids her or her family from writing or speaking of her crimes for pay. Angela Davis, the other Brandeis alum, has no such provisions. Hers is a complicated tale, but here's the short version. She got tied up in a kidnapping case, took off, and after a couple of months on the FBI Most Wanted list, was captured. That was all back in 1970. Since then, she spent most of her time as a far left activist, college professor, and public speaker for profit. Australian-born serial killer Christopher Wilder became known as the Beauty Queen Killer for 2 reasons. The first is that one of his probable victims, Elizabeth Kenyon, had been a finalist in the Miss Florida pageant, and the second is that he often offered to take modeling photographs of women to gain their trust. After a series of sexual assaults in the United States and Australia between the late 60s and early 80s, Wilder began a terrifying murder spree in February 1984. He abducted at least 12 women and killed 9 more. The unknowns loosely tied to him are almost double that. When New Hampshire State Police spotted Wilder a mere 10 miles from the Canadian border, they moved to bring him in. During a wild struggle, Wilder fired his .357 Magnum handgun twice. One took himself out. He died almost immediately. Claude Dallas spent the winter of 1980 and 1981 as a mountain man in rural Idaho, living off the land and off the grid. The Virginia-born outdoorsman was known for his short temper. He beat animals and livestock that annoyed him, and was also notorious for poaching and over-trapping. When 2 Idaho Fish and Game officers, Bill Pogue and Conley Elms, responded to concerns about Dallas's activities, he shot them dead and bolted. After over a year on the run, he was captured in a brief firefight in Nevada and returned to Idaho for trial. Despite the fact that Elms was shot in the back, 2 holdout jurors believed Dallas's claims that he feared for his life. He was acquitted of first-degree murder. Instead, 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter and a gun charge sent him away for nearly 25 years. In May 1986, Dallas escaped prison and went on the run for almost a year before his recapture in 1987. In the process, he earned himself a spot on the FBI's Most Wanted list. While Dallas himself refused interviews during his prison term, he was lionized by a section of the American public who saw him as an outlaw hero. Dallas's story inspired songs, a made-for-TV movie, and a claque of groupies who attended his trial and called themselves the Dallas Cheerleaders. Despite this notoriety, he stayed under the radar since his 2005 release. Though she's one of the few women to make it onto this storied list, Brenda Delgado didn't spend much time there. The supposedly sweet-natured dental assistant had been dumped over email by her boyfriend Ricky Paniagua for dentist Kendra Hatcher. Delgado remained friendly with Paniagua, but began asking acquaintances around Dallas if they knew anyone who could hurt Kendra, or worse. Delgado's friend Crystal Cortez needed money, so for $500 she joined Delgado in the hunt for a hired killer. They found a weed dealer named Christopher Love who agreed to carry out the hit for $3,000 in drugs and cash. On September 2, 2015, Cortez drove Love to Hatcher's workplace in a borrowed Jeep Cherokee. He proceeded to kill Hatcher with 1 shot and steal her purse. The car was spotted on CCTV, and Cortez folded quickly under questioning. Her phone then led police to Love. Delgado hopped on a bus to her native Mexico and hid with family in Torreon. That's in the northern part of Mexico. She was peacefully apprehended just 2 days after she earned the Most Wanted title, extradited to Texas, and convicted of first-degree murder by a jury. It took them just 20 minutes to reach their decision. Delgado is currently serving life without parole.